All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second Partners webinar for the 2023 Spring Hydrologic Outlook. My name is Joseph Volk. I'm a hydrologist here at the National Water Center, and I'll be giving a general overview of the Spring Hydrologic Outlook for the Greater Mississippi Basin, Souris River, Red River of the North, and the Great Lakes Basins. We will also hear from representatives from each of the 5 river forecast centers for more detailed information on the flood potential for their respective regions. We do have a feedback form linked on the feedback tab at the right here. So please fill that out if you have time after the webinar. We'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on the changes to the presentation this year and in general. So the email reminder you received a bit ago has a link to a PDF copy of the story map if this is easier for you to follow along with. The webinar is being recorded and a follow-up email will be sent with key message information, a link to the story map, the final PDF copy of the story map, the feedback form, and a recording of the webinar. So this will likely be sent out by this evening, but at the latest it'll be sent out by first thing tomorrow morning. So should you have any questions during the presentation, please go ahead and type it into the question box in the GoToWebinar GUI, and we will address it at the conclusion of the presentations. All right, so let's get started. We'll start by looking at the past 2 weeks of accumulated precipitation percent of mean to see how things have changed since the last webinar. And generally speaking, conditions have been fairly wet across much of the greater Mississippi River Basin over the past 2 weeks, especially across upper portions of the basin, with more near normal precipitation across southern portions of the basin. In the upper Mississippi Basin, we've seen 200 to 500% of mean precipitation, which has led to an increase in the flood threat across that area. The lower Ohio River Basin, south of the Ohio River main stem, is seeing around 100 to 300% of mean precipitation over the past 2 weeks as well, moistening the top layer soils there. And then portions of the upper Missouri Basin have been wet with the 300 to 700% of mean precipitation over the last 2 weeks, with much of that falling as snow though. And remember that much of the Missouri Basin has been dry. So all this to say, conditions have moistened up a bit across much of the greater Mississippi Basin, especially the northern portions, which has led to some local increases in the flooding potential going forward. So we can tie this precipitation into our soil conditions across the basin and take a look at the Climate Prediction Center soil moisture ranking percentiles. And the biggest change in soil moisture conditions over the past 2 weeks is across the lower Arkansas Red Basin into the lower Mississippi Basin, where soils have moistened in response to that above normal rainfall shown in the previous graphic. And elsewhere, there have been minimal changes over the past 2 weeks, with the overall dry soil moisture conditions for the upper Arkansas Red and middle Missouri basins continuing. And then also note that across the Red River of the North Basin, there is near normal soil moisture currently locked into the frozen ground up there. And across the lowest portions of the Mississippi River Basin in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, we've done a complete flip from generally dry conditions at this time last year to soil moisture rankings above that 95th percentile this year. So that's enhanced some of the, which is enhancing the efficient runoff and the overall flood threat for this region as well. So considering the recent precipitation and soil moisture conditions, let's take a look at how this has impacted the USGS stream flows compared to historical flows for all days of the year. The main story we're seeing here is that over the past 2 weeks, stream flows have increased to above normal across portions of the lower Ohio Basin, mostly south of the Ohio River main stem there where it's been wet, across far lower portions of the Arkansas Red Basin into the middle Mississippi Basin, and across portions of the western Great Lakes region into portions of the upper Mississippi River Basin. So all this is potentially increasing the vulnerability to additional rainfall in the coming weeks. And this all makes sense given the recent rainfall that we've seen across a lot of these basins. But the flooding impacts will ultimately be dependent on the future rainfall amounts, so just keep that in mind. And then elsewhere across the greater Mississippi Basin, we're seeing near normal to below normal stream flows, which may potentially mitigate more widespread significant flooding concerns there. And then we did want to point out that across the northern tier, you don't see basins highlighted and just showing blank white basins, and that's due to the seasonal gauges either not taking measurements or being turned off, as many of them are iced in for this season. Now moving on to drought conditions and looking at the U.S. Drought Monitor. The only change from 2 weeks ago is across the far lower portions of the Arkansas Red Basin, where drought conditions have slightly improved. The remainder of the basins maintained its previous drought status from 2 weeks ago, with continued drought in the Middle Missouri and Upper Arkansas Red Basins, which is yet another limiting factor to widespread flooding potential there. And then we still have our lack of drought conditions continuing along and east of the Mississippi River, generally speaking. Now we'll focus on more of the wintry aspects of the outlook now and discuss temperatures, snow, and ice conditions across the basin. First focusing here on the past 2 weeks average temperature departures from mean, which shows the well above normal temperatures over the past 2 weeks across the majority of the greater Mississippi River Basin. The main impact of this is going to be on the river ice conditions and snowpack conditions, with a lot of river ice melting, breaking up, and moving downstream recently. And for the snowpack, the southern extent of the snowpack across portions of the Central Plains has decreased a little bit over the past 2 weeks in response to these temperatures. So all this combines to decrease the overall risk for localized ice jam flooding. And now looking at the current snow water equivalent and how recent temperatures have impacted it across the basin. There is still snow cover across much of the upper Mississippi Basin and much of the Missouri Basin as well, with generally above normal total water content in the snowpack across portions of these regions, which will play a role in the spring flooding potential across the upper Mississippi Basin. And Mike at North Central River Forecast Center will touch on this more here shortly. So there's virtually no snow water content across the Appalachians, the Ohio River Basin, and most of the Arkansas Red Basin. So snow and ice may not play much of a role in the spring flooding this year across those regions. And then the snowpack across the northern plains has definitely seen an increase in snow water equivalent over the past couple of days as that large winter storm has progressed through the region. So let's take a look at some of these changes. And comparing the current snow water equivalent, which we see here, compared to the snow water equivalent from 2 weeks ago, shown here. We can see that the southern extent of the snowpack and total water content has decreased just a little bit, mostly across central Nebraska and Iowa. But the total water content in the eastern Dakotas, Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and the UP of Michigan has increased. So here's 2 weeks ago, current here. And so the Winter Hydrology and Remote Sensing Desk here at the National Water Center will be coordinating with North Central River Forecast Center to get some flight lines set up in order to get a better assessment of the snowpack and total water across these regions, given that this system is still winding down. And then changing gears a little bit here to look forward to the next week of precipitation across the basin. The biggest story here is going to be coming up early next week as a low pressure system progresses across portions of the lower Missouri Basin and then into the upper Midwest, where there will likely be multiple precipitation types and potential for 1 to 2 inches of rainfall. So depending on exactly how this plays out, there could be potential for snowmelt and also rain on snow across the southern extent of the snowpack there, which would increase the threat for flooding across these regions. But there isn't much confidence yet on exactly how this is going to play out. And then for portions of the Ohio Basin into the Tennessee Valley, they could see around 1 inch, maybe up to 2 inches of rainfall mid to late next week. But right now it doesn't look to drastically change the overall hydrologic picture for the greater Mississippi Basin. All right, so we've made it to the long range portion of the overview. So we'll be bringing into context all of the past and ongoing hydrologic conditions and how the future temperatures and precipitation across the basin may or may not produce flooding impacts heading into the spring. So here we're looking at the Climate Prediction Center 8 to 14 day precipitation outlook where probabilities are weakly leaning towards above normal precipitation across the northern half of the greater Mississippi Basin, but there isn't a clear, strong signal for widespread significant precipitation. And now taking a look at the Climate Prediction Center 8 to 14-day temperature outlook, probabilities lean toward above normal temperatures along and east of the Mississippi River and point south of the Missouri-Mississippi confluence. But these regions don't have much snow available for melt, which is good, with the only exception to this being portions of the upper Midwest where there is a good bit of snow in place, but this region is kind of on the periphery of where the potential for above normal temperatures is. So it might not be too impactful given that the normal for this time of year is still pretty cold. Okay, so now looking even further out through March and into April and May at the Climate Prediction Center seasonal precipitation outlook, and probabilities lean toward above normal precipitation for the Ohio River Basin and near normal precipitation elsewhere. And this will be very important to watch how this plays out, as the flooding susceptibility in many locations across the greater Mississippi Basin is driven by convective rainstorms, which are very typical in the springtime. But for now, there isn't a strong signal for widespread significant above normal precipitation. And now for the same time period, but looking at temperatures, probabilities are favoring above normal temperatures across the lower portions of the greater Mississippi Basin. And there's still no indication of a prolonged significant warm-up across the northern tier, though, which is good in terms of mitigating widespread flooding impacts from rapid snowmelt alone. And we want to briefly shift focus to the Great Lakes region and provide an update there. We are not expecting impactful levels this year, and the Great Lakes water levels are running normal to slightly above normal and are projected to remain within about a foot or less of a normal into spring, and generally below the 2022 levels. And to summarize all of these ingredients we've discussed here and see what this means in terms of actual tangible river flooding, we can look at the long-range river flood risk outlook valid through late May. So the flood risk is above normal for Minnesota, northwest Wisconsin, the upper peninsula of Michigan, and the main stem Mississippi River down to the St. Louis area. Across the lower Mississippi tributaries in Louisiana and Mississippi, flood risk is above normal for minor to moderate flooding this spring. And elsewhere, the flood risk across the greater Mississippi River Basin remains near normal for this year, meaning that minor to moderate flooding is possible this spring. And now I'll pass it to Brian at Ohio Basin River Forecast Center for more details on that region.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Brian Estefan, the Development and Operations Hydrologist here at the Ohio River Forecast Center. And to kind of start off where Joe left off here, this is the same graphic we just saw, showing the 50% probability of exceedance, basically what flood potential has at least a 50-50 chance of occurring this spring. And the message here is that our flood threat across the Ohio Valley in general is normal this spring. Minor flooding is expected across primarily the western half of the basin, the Wabash and various tributaries in Indiana, some portions of the Maumee River Basin in northwestern Ohio, and portions of the Green and Kentucky rivers across the state of Kentucky and some of their tributaries. Those are fairly normal flood potentials for this spring period between February and April. And just for context, a lot of those rivers, especially in that heart of orange you see there, historically 50 to 80% or more of the years historically experience flooding during this 3-month window. So minor flooding is certainly the norm in that part of the Ohio River Valley. Snow and ice, as Joe mentioned, with the unusual warm spring, we're actually starting to see spring leaf out conditions across the southern half of our basin already, which is highly unusual for February. But snow and ice are not expected to be significant factors in this year's flood potential. Not ruling out the possibility of some snowfall accumulation later on in the late winter, but that is not really going to play into our flood considerations this spring. If we can go to the next slide, this shows the 25% probability of exceedance across the Ohio River Valley, kind of showing what the higher level, the high end potential is for flooding. And two trends here stick out. You still see the elevated minor flood threat throughout Indiana and western Ohio. You also see some higher probabilities across the state of Kentucky and into western West Virginia. And this coincides with those areas that were highlighted earlier of having recent heavy rainfall last week. There was already a round of widespread minor flooding with some isolated moderate flooding in those regions last week, and the current higher soil moisture levels is driving a little bit higher potential for moderate flooding in the next couple months until things really green out and start to dry out the soils a little bit. A listing of all the rivers that kind of are impacted by this higher range potential of moderate flooding are listed on the left, and as well in the notes that came out. But again, this is fairly normal flood risk across the Ohio River Valley for the spring time of year. Ultimately, the flood potential is driven by the frequency, intensity, and how widespread rainfall is across the basin over the next several months. Our most severe flooding typically comes from 2 to 3 storm events that are fairly wet and follow each other in close succession across the basin. And we've had a couple individual storm events produce the minor flooding. Any moderate flood potential is typically driven either by heavy convection in that repeated storm pattern, which is possible at the 25% threshold for the next couple months here. We can go to the next slide. This kind of zooms in on the next 2 weeks, 10 days to 2 weeks window, showing the probabilities now just in this shorter time frame. And you can see a lot of the squares, which in this instance here indicate a 70% potential of minor flooding, all through the Wabash River Basin and up into the Maumee River Basin in northwestern Ohio. A lot of that is driven in part by the storm system, which is now just departing the region. Very heavy rains of several inches fell across northern Indiana into northwestern Ohio in the last 24 to 36 hours. And that is producing minor flooding throughout those regions that you see highlighted in the orange squares there. We're also tracking 2 additional systems, which are forecast to track across the basin next week. And that's where you're seeing a lot of the elevated potentials for action stages and minor floods throughout the remainder of Ohio, Kentucky, and into the eastern portions of the basin. The ultimate track and intensity again of those would be dictate what the ultimate flood levels are there, but there is certainly the potential for additional minor flooding next week within the Ohio River Valley. But again, just to summarize real briefly, our flood potential for this year is fairly normal, and some flooding, especially in the minor scale, is expected this spring. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike up in North Central RFC and have him take you down the upper Mississippi River.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks to Joe for setting us up with the overview of the climate information. So let's take a look at the area covered by the North Central River Forecast Center. And in our neck of the woods, we've had some changes since our last outlook we had 2 weeks ago. That big system that came through right around Valentine's Day brought us a good deal of precipitation in our area. Much of that actually fell as rain, and that was from Iowa up into Minnesota and western Wisconsin. We did have widespread amounts of 1/2 to 2/3 of an inch in that area. Some spots up around an inch, and all that water, some of it went into the snowpack and caused some melting. Some of it made it all the way through the pack and down into the ground, and some of it actually ran off into the waterways. But it's been kind of difficult to determine just how much and where that water actually is. So we do see a pretty good block of ice at the bottom of the snowpack. So there's definitely some water still there. With the limited frost, some of that water probably also went into the ground. So the truth of it is it's probably a combination of all of those things. And either way, we are expecting that additional water to cause a change, resulting in now a above average risk for flooding. And that'll cover much of Minnesota, northwest Wisconsin, into parts of the upper peninsula of Michigan. And it's also above normal now for the main stem Mississippi River all the way down to around the St. Louis area, as you can see in this image here, as all the water runs off and concentrates into the larger river system. Elsewhere across our service area, we continue to classify our risk for spring flooding overall to be around normal, perhaps maybe a lean towards below normal across lower Michigan, where they've had a little bit less snow so far this year. So in these above normal risk areas that I mentioned, minor flooding is pretty probable in those areas, and the flooding into the moderate or even major categories is a possibility. For the remainder of our area, for any locations that do experience flooding, we expect that to remain primarily in the minor category. So let's look at this plot now. You can see the red and purple icons. They're focused mainly along the Mississippi, and that shows that greater than 50% likelihood of reaching the moderate or even major flood level. And there's also a smattering of red icons elsewhere across the map too. Overall, looking at this, there are more spots that are indicating flooding is likely than we did see in our outlook 2 weeks ago. All right, so on the next image, we're going to take a look at the snow water equivalent ranking as we had in our modeling system as of Monday. You can see that we do have ample snow cover seen across North Dakota and Minnesota and stretching into northwest Wisconsin. That's shown by the darker blue shades there. Snow water content is generally between 2.5 and 4 inches for most of that area, maybe just a little bit more now that we've got this storm system that's just exiting. There are some 5 to 8 inch amounts of snow water closer to Lake Superior. This snow water is in the top 10 or 20% of our historical records, so above normal amounts of snow water for this time of year. Meanwhile, down across Iowa, southern Wisconsin, over to lower Michigan, you see those yellow, orange, and red colors. That indicates snow water content well below normal for this time of year. And where you see the gray, we had no snow on the ground as of Monday. Of course, this was from Monday, so obviously with that system moving through now, it's changed just a little bit. And if you recall back to the snow water image that Joe showed, it showed that water content has shifted just a bit further south now, especially across Wisconsin and parts of northern Iowa. All the snow and the water content of that snow is included in our outlooks, which I did show earlier on that previous slide. All right, now taking a look at the next image, we're going to look at frost depth, and you'll see that there's not really a great deal of frost that's deep out there. The depth is generally a foot or less across the majority of our area. The only areas that show deeper than that are up in the Dakotas and up into northwest Minnesota. The frost there is a little bit more solid, a little bit deeper, but it also corresponds to the area where the soil conditions going into fall freeze up were the driest. So despite having the snow on the ground, when we do get our melt, we think at least some of that water is going to be able to infiltrate into the soil or be retained in other off-channel storage areas that have been dry recently. And that should reduce the runoff potential overall. However, they probably will see some minor flooding in those areas in a few spots. And finally, now on the last image, I wanted to show just graphically how our flood risk has changed since 2 weeks ago. Thanks to that additional water that was added from the storms last week and the one this week, note on the left image now how the black triangle line, that's our conditional simulation based off current conditions, has shifted further up and to the left in that image there on the left side. It's now quite a bit higher than those blue dots, and the blue dots indicate the historical average in a normal year. So this shift toward higher probabilities is similar across much of Minnesota and into Wisconsin, and then all down the Mississippi River, and it shows that increase in risk from the outlook 2 weeks ago. And these images all correspond to those colored dots you saw on that first slide we showed. So with cooler temperatures anticipated through March, as Joe showed us, and above normal precipitation, we definitely are going to have to watch out how future precipitation and melt conditions evolve over the next 6 to 8 weeks. And that's it for my area. For now, I will pass it off to Kevin Lau at the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center.
Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start off by saying that we continue to have an overall reduced risk for flooding across the Missouri Basin this spring. Only a handful of the 400 plus locations that we forecast have an above average flood risk this season, while the majority of locations have a near normal to much below normal flood risk. Approximately 1/4 of the basin, centered primarily on the northern plains, has a flood risk that's been reduced from normal by anywhere from -10 to as much as -30%. And this comes as no surprise. The Missouri River Basin is entering its 3rd year of drought. The latest drought monitor that was released this morning has 60% of the Missouri River Basin categorized in some level of drought. The previous 3 water years, water year 20, water year 21, and water year 22, together are the 10th driest 3-year period in the 125 years of record. As the graphic that you see on the screen shows, we do expect minor to moderate flooding anyway, even despite the ongoing drought within a few of the watersheds comprising the basin this spring. And I'll give you a list of those rivers that we do expect to have flooding this season. They include the James, Vermilion, and the upper reach of the Big Sioux in South Dakota, the North Platte River in Wyoming, the upper reach of the Little Sioux in Iowa, the Meredicine and Stranger Creek in eastern Kansas, the Little Osage River that flows from Kansas into Missouri, the Grand, Sheraton, Blackwater, Platte, and Gasconade rivers in the state of Missouri, along with several of the other smaller tributaries within the state of Missouri. The Missouri River itself, downstream of Kansas City, will also likely experience episodic minor level flooding, between now and the end of May, and that will be due to thunderstorm activity. Again, that's the lower end of the Missouri main stem. Despite the incredibly dry soils across the bulk of the basin, we do thankfully have a healthy snowpack this season, both in the mountains as well as the plains. And this is actually good for water supply, but overall does not pose a huge concern for flooding. Looking at the mountains with our next graphic, and this graphic is courtesy of the Natural Resources Conservation Service. This graphic shows by sub-basin the snow water equivalent in terms of percent of average that we currently have in the mountainous west. Mountain snowpack can be generally categorized as being near to slightly above average for this time of year. By this point in the winter, we have normally accumulated approximately 75% of the seasonal peak snow water equivalent in the mountainous west. So what does this average to above average snowpack mean for spring mountain runoff? And that's what our next and final graphic depicts. The graphic shown here depicts the expected April through September runoff volume from the mountains at discrete points, about 60 locations. Our latest water supply outlook would indicate a below average runoff year for much of the mountainous west, with the exception of the North Platte Basin. And in the North Platte, we expect a slightly above average runoff year. But even with this slightly higher than average runoff year for the North Platte, we are currently outlooking only 1 or 2 locations in the very upper reaches of the North Platte River in Wyoming to experience minor flooding this spring. As was mentioned earlier in today's briefing, the Northern Plains has quite a bit of plains snowpack, with 2 to 4 inches of snow water equivalent being reported in the Milk River Basin, up to 4+ inches across the Dakotas, as well as in northwestern Iowa. And a strong system just exited the basin overnight, and that dropped several inches of fresh snow, snow depth, not SWE, but snow depth, centered mainly on South Dakota. However, though an above average plain snowpack year in most areas, or in many areas, we don't expect widespread significant flooding to result. Not only are the soils still very dry due to the ongoing drought, but the existing plain snowpack has also precluded, we believe, the development of a deeply frozen ground condition across much of the plains area in the Missouri Basin. I do want to say a word about ice jam flood risk. Despite the low water conditions, or maybe because of it, river ice has already presented challenges within the Missouri Basin this year. River ice has resulted in elevated river stages along the Gallatin River in Montana, the South Fork Shoshone River in Wyoming, and along the lower reach of the North Platte in Nebraska. And I'm sure there's been other locations as well. Thus far, impacts from these western freeze-up jams have been minor and localized. The bitter cold snap that affected the basin in mid to late December also resulted in ice jams in the lower Missouri River itself, one in the Nebraska-Iowa reach and the other in the reach below Kansas City. Neither of these jams resulted in flooding, but both of these jams resulted in record low stages being set along the Missouri River. Going forward, we believe that we have a below normal risk for ice jam breakup flooding this season, but as long as we have ice in the rivers and snowpack on the ground, the risk nevertheless still exists. Thunderstorm activity drives springtime flooding in the southeastern third of the Missouri Basin. 2 weeks ago, during our first spring outlook, a rain event in the state of Missouri resulted in about 3 locations experiencing minor flooding in the state of Missouri. And this recent flooding marked only the 3rd rain-driven flooding that we've experienced within the basin this water year. I will say that we are monitoring what could be a fairly significant rain event in the lower basin this Sunday evening into Monday. To summarize then, spring flood risk in the Missouri River Basin is reduced from normal this year. But while the risk is reduced, some minor to moderate flooding is still projected. Thank you. And this concludes the Missouri River Basin flood potential brief. And I'll pass the mic along to Becky Harjo at the Arkansas Red Basin River Forecast Center.
Thanks, Kevin. The long-range river flooding outlook for the Arkansas Red Basin River Forecast Center is near normal. It's very similar to our climatological risk of river flooding. Moderate and minor river flooding is expected on the Neosho, Poto, and Illinois rivers in eastern Oklahoma, which is expected as these rivers typically have a greater than 50% chance of flooding every spring. Minor flooding is also expected on the Arkansas River and its tributaries, including the Fushlefov and Petty rivers in Arkansas and the Spring River in Missouri. Minor flooding is also expected on the tributaries to the Red, namely the Deep Red Creek. Now, taking a look at our snowpack, we've got a little bit more snow than we did 2 weeks ago. The snowpack equivalent in the headwaters of the Arkansas River Basin is currently below normal. The snowpack in this area, it typically peaks around the beginning of May. The snowpack in the more southern headwaters of the Arkansas Basin are still well below normal, currently down to the range of 40 to 55%. The snow water equivalent for the headwaters of the Canadian River is just below normal for this time of year, and the snow water equivalent for the headwaters of the Red River Basin are at 97 to 100% of normal, so 170% normal, excuse me. So they're just to near normal or just a touch over. Now, taking a look at our reservoirs, the reservoirs in the Arkansas River Basin currently have about 97% of their total flood control storage capacity available, and the Red River Basin currently has about 93% of its flood control storage available. So both basins are in great shape right now to hold any springtime floodwaters. And both the reservoirs in the lower part of the Arkansas River Basin and the lower part of the Red River Basin still have their conservation storage nearly full. Now I'll turn it over to Jeff Groschel from the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center to talk about their area.
Okay, thank you, Becky. As far as the lower part of the Ohio and lower part of the Mississippi River, we're kind of looking at normal conditions or just average flood risk for our area of the Mississippi River based on our upstream offices. We really pretty much recovered from the low water conditions that we had back in October on the lower Ohio and lower Mississippi River. Currently have a little bit of a wave coming down the lower Ohio at this time, and maybe some crushing conditions in a couple of days with probably the highest risk we've had so far this season from rainfall from last week over the Tennessee and Ohio valleys. Kind of long range models are kind of looking at the rainfall that Kevin was describing in Missouri, and then some of the rainfall that may get into the Ohio Valley that Brian was describing may give us another rise, maybe in mid-March. That may be a few feet higher than what we currently have at Cairo now, but maybe just a few feet higher than the current stages that we're looking at. So some minor flooding potentially looking at for maybe mid-March on the lower part of the Ohio, and then work its way down through the lower part of the Mississippi River. But again, seasonal crests that we're looking at right now, and we're not looking at anything more than just normal average conditions on the lower Mississippi River. Other areas though, especially in Louisiana and Mississippi, we had 10 to 20 inches of rainfall over the last 6 weeks over these areas. So these areas in Louisiana, Mississippi, especially the southern parts, have had are pretty elevated at this time. We still got minor to moderate flooding occurring at this time across those locations. So the flood risk will be a little higher for those areas, specifically like the Calcasieu River system, Pearl River system, Pascagoula River system, and Big Black River systems in Mississippi. But the remainder of our area, though, we are just anticipating just normal flood risk for those areas at this time. And as always, rainfall really is the determining factor for that final outcome for flood risk for our area in the late winter and spring. So with that, I will turn it back over to Joe.
All right, thank you everybody for the informative briefing. So to summarize the potential impacts for the greater Mississippi River Basin spring hydrologic outlook for the second update, the flood risk is considered near normal in the Ohio and Cumberland Valley regions along with the Lake Erie drainages. The greatest chances for flooding are on the tributaries in Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio. And then the flood risk is above normal, meaning that moderate to major flooding is possible for Minnesota and northwest Wisconsin and into the upper peninsula of Michigan, and also for the main stem Mississippi River all the way down to near the St. Louis area. Elsewhere across the upper Mississippi Basin and northern tier, the overall flood risk is considered near normal, as frost remains limited and could allow for some infiltration into the soils, which will limit the runoff potential there. Overall, there continues to be a reduced flood risk for the Missouri River Basin, and the flood risk is normal on the eastern rivers of the Arkansas Red Basin, as well as on the tributaries to the Arkansas and Red Rivers themselves, meaning that minor to moderate flooding is possible this spring. And finally, the flood risk is normal for the lower Mississippi River, meaning that minor flooding is possible. However, above normal rainfall has raised the flood risk to above normal across Louisiana and Mississippi, making minor to moderate flooding possible. All right, so that concludes our presentation. If you have a question for any of our presenters, please utilize the question box on the GoToWebinar GUI. And as a reminder, there is a feedback form that we would really appreciate everyone filling out, since we did make a lot of changes to the presentation format this year. So I'll give it just a minute here and see if any questions roll in. Okay, I'm not seeing any chats or questions at this time, so thank you everybody for your time. There will be a follow-up email sent no later than tomorrow morning with a bunch of information from this webinar. The third and final partner webinar will be Thursday, March 9th. So we will see you all there. Thanks again and have a great day, everybody.